start with a couple of quotations from Nishitani and Laruelle to kick off the presentation on the non-self and the one. The first one is from Nishitani's late work, Religion and Nothingness. It isn't that the self is empty, but emptiness is the self. Not that things are empty, but that emptiness is things. And now the second one is much more complicated. It has to do with Laruelle's, it's a very, very complicated text by Laruelle, just as complicated as Parmenides, I would say. And here I've copy-pasted the full iterations of the axioms that he includes in the subsections of the text. So it goes like this. If the one that is one because it is one rather than because it is or is other determines the other in the last instance, what happens to the other is the non-decisional decision of itself, non-self-decisional decision. If the one that is one because it is one rather than because it is or is other determines unity in the last instance, what happens to unity? Unity is non-synthetic and non-analytic of itself, non-self-synthetic analytic. So, and my presentation, I kick off with these two quotations, has double function. To sum it up in advance, on the one hand, I'm trying to work with Laruelle and his notion of the one as something that I see as a view without perspective, a view of the world without perspective, a perspectivist view. And then through Nishitani and through his implied use of anatta as the groundwork of shunyata, which is something that is that can be summarized as a view without a view. So a view without a perspective in terms of Laruelle and a view without a view. Now, the history of the notion of the one is well documented in the work of Laruelle, such as in the just quoted text My Parmenides or in Struggle and Entropy at the End Times. Although Laruelle rarely states his agenda, he practically pushes to the extreme a non-Platonist agenda of reversing the notion of the one to a state of relative immanence in his division between the non-one and the non-one, written with moving parentheses between the word non and one. This reversal is a foundation for the rewriting of Western metaphysics and the obsessive focus on the one, which is mostly interpreted by the Tübingen School and the Tübingen thesis of Kremer and Geiser as the inexhaustible wellspring of the principle of sufficient philosophy. Now, at the same time, Laruelle doesn't account for the implied consequence of this reversal, namely that the immanentization of the one reduces it or uncovers it as a state of nothingness, out of which the very reality of the world is not the real itself. In other words, so this is more of a hypothesis, but I'm working on it. In other words, the Laruellian one, however revolutionary and inverting the entire Platonic tradition, jeopardizes the investigation of the real with a certain preternatural non-reality, which is a point that, to honesty, is somewhat clarified in the short text on the Black universe. Now, one way of accounting, this is the experiment of the paper, one way of accounting for this unreflected reversibility of the one and the specter of the non-real that I see lurking behind is to look at the philosophical materials in the Kyoto School and more precisely in the work of Nishitani and his late work, Religion and Nothingness, where Nishitani used shunyata and anatta as the non-ego. Now, let me just briefly say that the use of anatta in this paper and in the title is quite speculative. Almost nowhere in Religion and Nothingness does Nishitani speak of anatta. Now, the reason why I go on to speak of anatta is because I treat it as the groundwork of shunyata, obviously in terms of Mahayana and Nagarjuna, and this is just a prefatory note to clear the air around this, for the simple reason that the textual evidence in Nishitani is not there in and of itself. Now, I want to continue with a quotation from Nishitani on self and things, where he says the following. On the field of reason, the selfness of things merely represents the sort of form in which they appear to us who happen to be thinking about them. The function of thinking as an activity of reason in us is to journey beyond the field of sense perception to a field on which things can be made to disclose their selfness. Therein lies the particular significance of thinking. But for that very reason, the substance or the object grasped on the field of reason cannot but be the mode of being of a thing in its selfness insofar as it appears to us and insofar as it is seen by us. We will be hard put to show that this points straight to the thing itself in its mode of being, where it could be said to be on its own home ground. Such original selfness must lie beyond the reach of reason in being previous to thought. I think it is a very rich and interesting quotation, because it somehow allows us to glimpse at this a perspectivism I opened with, or in other words, a view without a view on the world. I think so. Some other prefatory notes before I continue that I want to mention. In general, if one would compare the one, it should be juxtaposed, and I think this was glimpsed somehow in Hannes' paper. It should be juxtaposed to shunyata in general, or to mu. But here I do it with anatta for, again, the simple reason that anatta is the groundwork of shunyata. In terms of comparability, and what's the comparative ground of where I'm going with this, is that the one, nothingness, and the non-self, which is anatta, neither of them are things. So it's important to say this. All the more so, this is important all the more so because the one is beyond being in the philosophical sense of the word, in the Plotinian sense of the word. Now, of course, in Laruelle, that's reversed, and the picture is quite different, but it still has a conceptual grounding. There is a place in Dictionary of Non-Philosophy where Laruelle says that the one is an ancient transcendental, and I think that's important. So in general, the philosophical use of the one in philosophy is, so the one in philosophy in its philosophical use is employed from within the limitations of the notion of ineffability. Whereas I think in non-philosophy, the way that Laruelle reverses the one, and here I'm not going to go into the extended details of the non-philosophical one, given the nature of the conference, but in terms of Laruelle and non-philosophy, the one is somewhat close to something we can call incognitivity of the one. And another general note here is that Nishitani, I'll get back to this again, but Nishitani turns to absolute nothingness or zetai mu, and then to shunyata in his later work. But both of them, shunyata and the one, they represent a turn to the things themselves. On the surface of this requires a kind of conception of the self. And one way of looking at this is that anatta, as the non-self, is a sort of quasi-philosophical concept of the self. So non-self as the self. So another important aspect here is that if we juxtapose one with mu, both of them are non-being, out of which being arises. But that's only true if we speak about the philosophical Plotinian one. So here is a quotation from Nishitani and Mu, where he says the following: absolute nothingness, wherein even a thing that is nothingness is negated, is not possible as a nothingness that is taught, but only as a nothingness that is lived. Now, I think this is clear that Nishitani moves away from Nishida's Mu and employs shunyata in large part because he wants to problematize the predicate absolute in a novel way. Now, one of my main questions here is it possible to supplement Laruelle's reversion of the one with Nishitani's use of anatta and shunyata, or anatta as the groundwork of shunyata, in order to prevent non-standard philosophies one shrinking into a sort of concept? I do believe that the Laruellian one is still a concept, that that shunyata is kind of not. And in addition, is it fair to conjugate both thinkers as proponents of so-called Nemocentrism, a view propounded by Thomas Metzinger, and superpose the one and the non-self as a duality in terms of comparative philosophy? Now, let me move briefly on Nemocentrism and give a little bit of information on that. So what is Nemocentrism? This is an idea that's largely associated with Thomas Metzinger in his neurophilosophy, the ego tunnel and being no one being the two major references here, where he says, we now arrive at the maximally simple metaphysical position with regards to selves. No such things as selves exist in the world. At least their existence doesn't have to be presupposed in any rational and truly explanatory theory. This is a larger quotation. Okay, I'm gonna read it out. Phenomenal selfhood originates in a lack of attentional, sub-symbolic self-knowledge. Phenomenal transparency is a special kind of darkness. Perhaps, unfortunately, the responsibility of academic philosophy also consists in telling people what they don't want to hear. Biological evolution is not something to be glorified. It is blind, driven by chance, and it has no mercy. In particular, it is a process that exploits and sacrifices individuals. As soon as individual organisms start to consciously represent themselves as individuals, these facts will inevitably be reflected in countless facets on the level of phenomenal experience itself. Therefore, defining our own goals involves emancipating ourselves from this evolutionary process, which over millions of years has shaped the micro-functional landscape of our brains and the representational architecture of our conscious minds. Now, one important thing that I want to single out here is that while Nemocentrism obviously propounds the idea that the self is illusionary, this is also something quite ancient, which can be glimpsed in the notion of dukkha, where there is no self, but also there is no liberation from suffering too. The difference between something like Nemocentrism and the ancient idea of dukkha would here be that in one of the cases, there is a liberation from suffering sought for, whereas I don't think in a doctrine, scientific doctrine as Nemocentrism, this is really important. Now I'm going to move on to Mahayana Buddhism, and because it is the important groundwork for the use of shunyata and anatta in Nishitani, and just give some very basic stuff in order to proceed toward the end of my presentation. Here's an interesting example from, it's a very famous quote from the Heart Sutra that speaks to the doctrine of the non-self and the employment of the notion of emptiness. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is not separate from form, form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness, whatever is emptiness is form. Just a moment. So the concept of shunyata as emptiness is related to the concept of anatta. In early Buddhism, in the Kyoto School, this is mostly associated with Zen, Rinzai, Dogon, and Soto schools. Now, in Theravada Buddhism, shunyata refers to the non-self. In Pali, it's called anatta. It's to the non-self nature of the five aggregates of experience and the six senses spheres. The Mahayanic school is the important one here, which preaches that all things are empty. Here are the various iterations of non-self in Pali, Sanskrit, and Japanese. So anatta is this fundamental aspect of shunyata in terms of Nagarjuna and the school of the middle way. Anatta is one of three marks of existence, along with dukkha, suffering, and anicca, impermanence. So here is a definition of emptiness from the glossary provided at the end of Religion and Nothingness, which goes like this. Shunyata in accord with the image suggested by the Chinese character, it is said to be sky-like and is compared in the text to an all-encompassing cosmic sky. The same character can be read in adjectival form in munashi, thus creating a phonetic resemblance to mu or nothingness. All right. Just a moment. Now, in works such as Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani focuses on, as I said, the Buddhist term shunyata, emptiness or nothingness, in its relation to Western nihilism. To contrast with the Western idea of nihility as the absence of meaning, Nishitani's shunyata relates to the acceptance of anatta. One of the three so-called right understandings in the so-called Noble Eightfold Path, and the rejection of the ego in order to recognize the pratitya shamatupada to be one or to be one with everything. Now I'm gonna go to some quotations from Nishitani that I think also illustrate, and I'm going to wrap up the presentation, that also illustrate where I'm going with this finally in the conjugation with Laruelle and non-philosophy. These quotations are all from part 3 of Religion and Nothingness. And this is the part where Nishitani focuses on shunyata. I think just as a general comment, in part 3 of Religion and Nothingness, what Nishitani hopes to do is to exit the philosophical version of absolute nothingness as a negative theology. He has learned quite a lot of lessons from his training in German philosophy and mysticism. At this point, this is 1961 again, as it's a late contemplative work. And here goes the quotations that I think are important. In order to approach the fact that fire is, reason invariably goes to the root of asking what fire is. It approaches actual being by way of essential being. This standpoint doesn't enter directly and immediately to the point at which something is. It doesn't put one directly in touch with the home ground of a thing, with the thing itself. And here is his critique of representationalism. Both materialism and idealism lose sight of the basic field where the reality of things and praxis initially come about. They lose sight of the sort of field where things become manifest in their suchness, where every action, no matter how slight, emerges into being from its point of origin. And here he speaks on the field of emptiness. And by this field, he means the field of shunyata, emptiness. I think there is like a sound return here, obviously, to Mahayana, overriding some of his allegiances to Nishida. And I think it's important to also note that Nishitani speaks of selfness in terms of shunyata here, which isn't necessarily the case elsewhere. On the field of emptiness, the selfness of a thing cannot be expressed simply in terms of its being one thing or another. It is rather disclosed precisely as something that cannot be so expressed. Selfness is laid bare as something that cannot on the whole be expressed in the ordinary language of reason, nor for that matter in any language containing logical form. Should we be forced to put it into words all the same, we can only express it in terms of a paradox, such as, it isn't this thing or that, therefore it is this thing or that. And this is a central quotation because I think it does express this background of anatta as a doctrine, lurking in the background of the use of shunyata. And so my conclusion, going to the conclusion of all that, and the sort of experiment I'm doing with, in terms of Laruelle and Nishitani, is that now for Laruelle, the one has a certain nemocentric value, I think. And the nemocentrism of the one is immanently implied in terms of, but in terms of Nishitani's use of shunyata, anatta is the groundwork of a theory of syncretic quasi-subjectivity that makes the way for the self-overcoming of nihilism. In short, the one and anatta function as a cross-cultural pair of nemocentrism. The one disallows selfhood, but anatta disallows oneness too, because there is no permanence to selfhood in terms of Nagarjuna. The transcendental ego, which can be seen as anatta, is inverted as immanent one when anatta is juxtaposed to the one. While in Laruelle's one, there is a call for a being no one, Nishitani's shunyata is relatively alienated from the doctrine of anatta, but when taken together, they splice into a nemocentric dyad that puts the subject or the self in the absolute relativity of nothingness as something that is in place. And again, this absolute relativity of nothingness that is in place, I think is summarized by this experiment that I'm doing between a view without a perspective, or Laruelle's one, and a view without a view in terms of Nishitani. I'm just gonna finish with this quotation from Religion and Nothingness. If the hot thing, or any element for that matter, is a mode of being that has nothing at all to do with our representations or judgments, on its, it's not if, on its home ground, a thing is purely and simply itself as it is in its selfness and nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanimir. We have time, so we can add 5 minutes because we kind of delayed things, and until 9:05 Q&A. So the floor is open. Just raise hand or unmute and speak.
Well, shall I start? Thanks for this. Getting more pieces together now. I think I just have a comment and suggestion. Is another thing I've been working on recently is the idea of fana in Sufism, which may be translated as non-self, but basically it's more the annihilation of the self. And this annihilation in the Islamic context, this annihilation of the self gives again way to Allah, which in these terms is also more understood, not too much in the monotheistic sense, but I would say again comes very close, even to Shunyata, I'd say.
I don't know
if you have any relation to.
I don't know if this is comparable because I mean, thank you for the suggestion. I'll look it up. My own limited knowledge on Sufism comes from Algisus Davinish, that's all. But I think the notion you're referring to in Sufism, because you mentioned it relates to annihilation, it's difficult to compare to anatta for the simple reason that anatta comes from Mahayana. Mahayana is the middle way between eternalism and annihilationism, right? So, so it's not an extreme philosophical or quasi-philosophical doctrine, Mahayana Buddhism. It's not annihilationism, right? So the idea is of anatta is not the annihilation of self. more the initial situatedness of the known self as it is. So I'll check it up. I'll be curious to check it out. Thank you.
So you would go that Mahayana simply goes a step further, right? If there's nothing, if there's no self from the beginning on, there's also nothing to be annihilated.
Mahayana is, I don't know if you can define it as a step further, depends on where you want to position yourself conceptually. But I mean, first of all, we're discussing Mahayana because it's important for Nishitani and the Kyoto School, obviously, but especially for late Nishitani. But the second thing is simply the destruction or the annihilation of the self is extremely anthropomorphic and anthropological, right? And I don't think this concern is present in Mahayana Buddhism and in Zen or Rinzai especially. I mean, there is a kind of self without a self because it is existent, I guess, but it's, I think the concern in Mahayana is to move away from this anthropological focus on destructing the self. I'm not an expert in Japanese philosophy. It's just where I'm going with this and how I understand it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Lee. Unmute yourself and you can speak. Yeah.
Yeah, just a comment on this. I believe that in the Zen tradition, they do have their undertakings, I think, lead to a crisis point, like a cul-de-sac, not of the true self, but of the ego self, we might say. So that they do speak of a great death, along with a great doubt, a buildup of a great doubt. But we're speaking about the initial given predicament of oneself. One doesn't start off enlightened. One has to somehow achieve it, but it can't be achieved. So it's only achieved at some point of collapse or a death, I think we could say, a death of the ego self, along with which you have the awakening. There's a great doubt to a crisis point. I was speaking to Rocco the other day, and they might speak of it as climbing a 500-foot pole, standing at the top. This is like the limit point of your finite existence, and then stepping off. And this would be the great doubt and the great awakening, as I understand it in Zen Buddhism.
Thank you. This reminds me just that the point of crisis you're talking about in Zen is probably in some ways related to the ideal of bodhisattva in Mahayana. In other words, it's an exoteric, not an esoteric teaching, right? So the idea is to spread the knowledge. It's not to contain it.
There's a comment from Mabugani. Stanimir, if you want to address it.
Yeah, just so we should consider Fana with its concomitant term Baka abiding. I'm not an expert at all in Sufism, so I'm not sure on the bearing of Baka.
It's 9 p.m. in Tokyo. We're actually right on time. If there are no more questions or comments, we can take a break. So is there anyone else who would like to speak? All right, in that case, I would like to thank Stanimir for taking on Nishitani and expanding on the scope of inquiry that we had throughout this conference in relation to Laruelle and various thinkers from the Kyoto School. So I propose a lengthier pause, maybe before the round table, we can all return, say 30 minutes, so 9:30 p.m. Tokyo time, and whatever time you're seeing, just add 30 minutes. So you don't have to disconnect, just mute yourselves, and or if you feel like talking to each other, go ahead, use this, use the Zoom if you see, if you would like to talk to other who are present here today. So unfortunately, unlike a normal conference, we can't just mingle in the lobby of the conference hall or something like that. So this is what we have. Thank you all for staying with us until now, and let's conclude the conference in 30 minutes with a roundtable, which will be moderated by Takeshi Morisato. All right, see you all in 30 minutes.